Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Let's Talk About It with Jackie and Megan. Today we are joined by Bryan, who's going to be sharing his journey from converting from Protestantism, I believe it's Church of Christ, to Catholicism. So before we start, Bryan, I know you have your own YouTube channel. Would you mind just sharing with our guests a little bit about who you are and your own channel and why you
Yeah,
started it?
for sure. Yeah. So I have a YouTube channel called Quest for Faith with Bryan. And I started the channel because during my conversion process was during lockdown
Hmm.
and I needed to talk about everything I was learning and just get things out. And so it was kind of a vent at the beginning. And I really only had about 7 videos planned at first. And so 3 years later, or 4 years later now, well, yeah, it'll be 4 years in November. Still coming out with videos. I do a lot of interviews, and really my goal with the channel is definitely I interview all different types. I interviewed y'all, and so that video will be coming out soon too, or it might be out before this one's out. We'll see. And but just trying to explain the Catholic faith to make it easier to understand. Because I think people can get wrapped around all the technicalities of it. And so that's kind of my goal, and is to just shine light onto the beauty of the Catholic Church, conversion stories, and just dive deeper into why we believe what we believe. So
Nice. Yeah, so I know that you are a convert and I'm a cradle Catholic. Megan's been Protestant her whole life. So neither of us have an experience of converting from our tradition, especially as adults. I don't know how I'm assuming it was in your
I
adulthood.
was 39 when the process started, so
Okay.
well into my adulthood.
Yeah.
So
And when and why did you start exploring Catholicism?
So, like you mentioned, I grew up Church of Christ, and my family is still very anti-Catholic, and I grew up kind of in that environment. Not that I don't know, it was a good environment, right? So I grew up very Bible centric. Church of Christ is very sola scriptura. Scripture means everything, and so I grew up with this real love for Scripture. Not that I acted on it enough. Like I had my ups and downs as everyone does when you're just growing up, right? But I still always had this love for scripture. And after I got married and we had our first child, and I think it was during grad school, I we kind of I don't know, Church of Christ just kind of there was things that were happening that were not sitting right with me there, and I could tell most Church of Christ churches were pandering and not sticking to their guns, and that was bothering me. And I'm like, okay, something's wrong here. And so my wife grew up Methodist, and after we finished grad school, I pretty much just stopped going to Church of Christ. And that was a really rough period of time. And so there was a good, I don't know, year and a half there where maybe not even a year. I'm gonna say like 8 months where we didn't really have a church home. Like I was kind of church shopping, but at the time I was a little bit mad at God, and I was like, man, this is awful. Like what is happening? Like I don't want to go to Church of Christ anymore. But it was so ingrained in me that that was the church I should go to, that it was really hard for me to look outside of that. And so, but I still felt this call that I needed to be in a church community. And I had a young son, and I'm like, no, my kid has to be raised in a church. I don't know what I'm going to do. And even though my faith was just in shatters at this point, not that I was going anywhere near the atheist route, but as far as like just being totally like on fire about my faith, that was just it was what is it, like a ember, like it was barely lit. And we ended up starting to go to a after a 6 7 months of church shopping. um Found this Methodist church that for me, they had a more traditional service, and they had the contemporary service, and I liked the music in the contemporary service. My wife liked the traditional service, and I was like, cool, band-aid, like this is just going to be my band-aid. Like I know I need to go to church, I know I like, and so I was kind of going through the motions, and that was kind of my, pun intended, Hail Mary to try and kickstart my faith again. And so we went there for 5, 6 years, and uh, so like about 2013, 14, my wife had heard about that the Apocrypha in most Protestant Bibles. Um, I always grew up believing that Martin Luther removed them in the 1500s, right? Like they were gone. And she read somewhere that they had been taken out in the 1800s, like that Protestant Bibles up until the 1800s had all 73 books. There was just like a label there that said, "Hey, these aren't canon, but they're still good to read." Um, and that sounded weird. I was like, that can't be right. Like that's not that long ago. I mean, we're talking, I think at this point I think 1880 is when you really, like, it was really hard to find a Protestant Bible at that point with the Apocrypha in it. And, but we were pregnant with our second. And so went through all that, and that kind of just fell by the wayside. So fast forward, another 4 years goes by, or maybe not four, probably 3 years goes by. And the Methodist Church, which they currently just split, and they're going through all that drama right now over gay marriage and gay clergy and all of that, it was bubbling up. And the conference in 2018, I think it was, voted on this, and they voted against it. And the basically how the voting landed is most of the international Methodist churches voted against it, and most of the American churches voted for it. And so I was really troubled by this, but I'm like, okay, we'll see what our church does. And sure enough, the preacher stands up that next Sunday on the pulpit saying he's very disappointed with the council, and he's going to lead a Bible study on how gay marriage is biblical. And that was the last time I went to church there. And that was in December, I think, of 2018. And so I felt I'd already done the church shopping, right? Like I'd already looked at all the main lines. And so it's like, well, let's look back at these Bible churches. Let's see if we can find anything. And there was just nothing seemed right. But then that thought about the Bible popped in my head again. I'm like, well, I'm not going to church. I got time. Let's dive into this. And so I started researching that, and that's really the kickoff point that started my journey towards Catholicism. Because even at that point, I wasn't thinking Catholicism at all. Like it took a few more steps, but that's kind of where it started.
And in the midst of all of this, so your family is Church of Christ. Uh, did you sort of keep it a secret from them, or were they aware, and how did they
100%.
react? Okay.
They had already jumped down my throat about becoming Methodist because Church of Christ is very anti church authority. So each church should
Yeah.
completely be on their own. And so there's no bishops, there's no hierarchy. It's just the elders are voted in the church, and they have say over what happens with that congregation, and there's no connection between the others.
Mm.
And so they had already jumped down my throat about the Methodist Church. But at the time, when I'm researching this, and I find out it was true that it was a movement started in 1826. The Bible Scottish Society had written a letter to the English Bible Society asking to let's stop printing Bibles with the Apocrypha, because they're not canon and it's cheaper to print them. So that's what I learned then. And I was like, that is the wrong reason to remove anything from the Bible. Like, if that's been in, even if you're a Protestant, you don't think that's canon, but that's been in there for, we're talking 300 plus years after Martin Luther at this point, like that should stay. And so I did have conversations with my mom about that, um, and that it troubled me. Because I think we went on a vacation to visit my family, kind of in the midst of all of this. And so I'd come to the conclusion that I didn't like that, but I my next thought wasn't necessarily Orthodox or Catholicism. It was like, I need to study Martin Luther and the
Mhm.
Reformation guys and go, why did they do this? And do I agree with their logic behind saying these books aren't canon? And so that was kind of my next thought. And yeah, I mean, it was kind of interesting talking to my mom about it because it was a brief conversation because I was too scared of the. I knew if I didn't agree with Luther and Calvin and all them that I could either go Orthodox or Catholic. Like those are your options pretty much. And I didn't want any of those options. So I hadn't really I brought it up like what isn't this concerning to you? And she just brings up something about the 400 years of silence argument and I was currently looking into that and was going, okay. All right. And that was about it. That's like all my parents knew and my family knew that what was happening at that point.
Okay, so I hear you bringing up like Orthodoxy or Catholicism is like were potential options. So you kind of started looking into the Apocrypha, and then what did your journey look like from there moving forward? Did you start looking into Catholicism and Orthodoxy? And what made you start leaning toward Catholicism? Whatever part of your journey you want to touch on.
Yeah. So essentially, I came up with about 5 reasons that the Apocrypha was created. And to kind of summarize, it's that some of those books were not written in Hebrew. So language, the 400 years silent, the which is basically that God didn't speak to the Israelites for 400 years because of a verse in First Maccabees. Um,
Mm.
the And then Martin Luther's bigger argument that I felt had the most weight because I didn't think the language made sense, right? Because Jesus spoke Aramaic, like Greek was the common tongue for a few hundred years at this point. Hebrew was basically spoken in the temple. Like it's a multicultural language. Like even on the cross, you had the King of the Jews written in Greek, Latin, and in Hebrew, right? I mean, so the language thing, I was like, that doesn't hold any water. The only one that I thought held water was the Jewish canon, right? So because his argument was like, hey, this is the books that the current Jews in Germany, even though he didn't like the Jews, but he was like, this is what they have. Like we should match their canon
Mm.
because they're the ones that wrote these books. Um, and my thought was that makes perfect sense if they had closed their canon before Christ. And that's where it all teetered. And I found like it's pretty easy to see that they didn't even in New Testament because we know the Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books. The Pharisees had a broader canon of scripture, but there wasn't like a set canon list even until about the 300s, like the late to early 300s for Jews. It was way after the destruction of the temple that it was finally kind of formalized and everybody started using the same books. And so I was like, that's out. So the only real difference in my ignorance of the two faiths between Orthodoxy and Catholicism
Mm.
was the papacy. And so that was kind of the next thing that I was like, okay, well, it's got to be one of these two. Because well, I'll back up a little bit, right? So, right when I'm coming to these conclusions about Luther and Calvin going, well, the Holy Spirit just told me that these aren't the books. Like, it feels like they shouldn't be canon, which I'm like, that is this. Anyways, um, I was like, I can't get on with that. But my wife at the time, so we're talking Lent 2019, and my wife is doing a Bible study for Lent on the book of John.
Mm.
And she's at this time, my wife is way more Catholic friendly than I was. Like she went to mass a lot with one of her friends in college. Her dad used to take them to midnight mass for Christmas all the time, even though he was a Methodist preacher. So she had a way more friendly outlook on Catholics than I did. And she had gotten to John chapter 6, and I got off work and she's like, I need you to listen to this talk. And it was Father Mike Schmitz doing a talk on John 6. and he was going through the second half of John 6 on the Bread of Life Discord. And I never ever heard it preached on like that. And it was a talk, it wasn't a homily or anything, but I'd never heard anyone talk about it like that. Like, as Protestants, I feel like we totally focus on the feeding of the 5,000, we focus on the walking of water, and then we kind of skip over the end of John 6. Like, I don't even in my Bible classes I took in college, I don't ever remember looking at the end of John 6. And it blew my mind the way he was talking about it. And one of the things that he said in there, and he was talking about he was saying that Christ, this is Christ saying that, yeah, I am going to be the sacrifice. The bread and wine, the host is going to be me, and you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. But the kicker for me was when that moved me, and I was like, that's crazy. And I'm like, I have to figure this out. So at the same time, I'm researching John 6, and I find out that about, I think it's verse 54, John 6:54. Um, so throughout this argument, right, the Jews are arguing back at him, and these are the same Jewish people that he just fed the day before, right? So they're on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They take the boat across. Jesus walks on water, and they're in Capernaum. And so all these people had just walked around the Sea of Galilee, are taking boats to find him in the temple in Capernaum, or synagogue, preaching. And that's where this conversation is happening. So these people just saw him do some amazing things. And so he keeps saying, eat my flesh and drink my blood. Well, if you read it in the Greek, the verb he uses to eat early on is just it's pheo, I think is a verb. I totally could be wrong. It's been a minute since I've
Yeah,
looked
it's
at it.
Fago.
Phego, yeah, okay, thanks. I just thought it was a G, and I was dropping the G
Yeah,
there.
a gamma.
Yeah, and it's just a common verb to eat, right? But then in 54, he switches it to fuego, or fuega, I think is what it is, which is the verb to gnaw on, or to devour.
Mhm.
And his language gets like more graphic and more secure, like the further he goes into this argument when they start pushing back on him. And then the fact that it says several of his followers left him that day and never returned over this teaching. And then that whole section there of him looking at the 12 and going, are y'all going to leave me now too? And Peter's like, Lord, where else would we go? And the arguments that I've heard against this not being, that he's not saying the Eucharist is the real presence, is based off verse 63, somewhere in there. It's at the very end when he talks about the flesh is weak, but the spirit is or is willing, or something like that.
Mm.
And that was like, I'm like that. I feel like a lot of times that one was taken out of context, and it wasn't a strong enough argument to deny everything that I was just reading in the beginning of that, or the right before that. And then even furthermore in chapter 7, so Jesus lets everyone leave, doesn't say anything. Like, he's like, yeah, that's it. Like, no clarification. Like, and so I'm like, he's speaking plainly here. He's not speaking in metaphors at this point. Um, and if you read the beginning of 7, it says they had to flee the region because he was going to be arrested and killed. So he doesn't, like, his life's in danger because of this talk. And he's still not going to say, well, no, what I really meant is it's going to be representation. It's going to be, so this blows my mind. And I'm like, wow, I think the Catholics and Orthodox have a thing here on the real presence. I really need to look into this Pope thing. So all this is going on at the same time. And so I start researching the Pope, and looking at looking at a number of different sources, looking at arguments against it, for it, praying that the arguments for it or against it were going to win me over, but nothing really could. And especially when I start looking at typology and the kingdom of God mirroring the kingdom of David, that was what kind of started solidifying it for me, especially when you read Matthew 16, and the Peter and the keys section there. and it mirrors Isaiah 22:22, which in Isaiah 22:22, it's a chief steward of the kingdom of Israel is being replaced. And what was the chief steward's job in the kingdom of Israel was to run the kingdom while the king was gone. And so he was given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever door he opened would stay open, whatever door he closed would stay closed. That's Isaiah 22:22. And then, then Christ is going, whatever you bound on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loosed on earth will be loose in heaven. And it just absolutely clicked that Christ was creating his kingdom, and that out of the 12 representing the 12 tribes of Israel, he would select one to be his chief steward, which would make sense that we call it a pope today, right? Father, Papa. But it just clicked, and I'm going, okay, now I'm freaking out. I need to look into the first century church and see if I see any of this, or still kind of doing a Hail Mary pray here. I keep saying Hail Mary because I'm a football guy, but I was just really hoping that I was going to see Protestantism in the first century church, because that would totally, like, oh, I don't have to do anything. I can just go back to Church of Christ. I'm good. Because one of the things with Church of Christ is they believe that they are exactly like the first century church, and that they're practicing their faith just like the first century church. And so that was kind of my next step.
I'm
So
just
as
curious.
you're looking into this, oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Jacque.
I just had a question. My mom grew up Church of Christ. Actually, one of my aunts still goes there, but I don't know their theology very well. What is their view on communion? I was just wondering, since you
It's
were,
a representation.
so it's completely
Yeah,
symbolic, like Zwingli type view.
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
And
I was just curious. Yeah.
they do communion every Sunday, and you can't take communion until you've been baptized.
Okay.
So they do have more of a reverence for it than, say, the Methodist Church, which anyone can take it, baptized or not. So they do have like a higher view of it, but it's still a symbol,
Okay. Yeah.
and it's still grape juice. But
I actually did receive once in a Church of Christ church, and I shouldn't have. My mom, we went to visit my aunt somewhere, and I was just really, really young. And my mom didn't really know any better. She had converted to Catholicism, and I don't know. I don't think her RCA was that great, probably. But
yeah,
all I remember is being so excited to get grape juice because I was thirsty, and I had no idea what was going on. Because I don't
and they
even know if
pass it around the pews. Did they do the whole,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
with
I
the
think
trays?
so. I was so little, and I don't even know. I forget how old I was. I think I had got my first communion by then in the Catholic Church, but
Okay.
I was like, oh, great. It's not going to be just a host. And because I don't know, I didn't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And I was so excited to have grape juice and crackers. And then they gave me the
Yeah.
little bit, and I was like, can I have more, please? Anyway,
Right.
sorry.
No, I totally get that, because I and that's the thing. It's like, I totally remember kids at the end of let's say mass service, if there was grape juice left, they would go and drink the rest of them.
That would have been me.
And I'm like, which
Jacque.
is really gross, right? Like,
Yeah.
everybody sipped on it. So have you gone to a Church of Christ church, Megan?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so how they do communion is they literally have the the bread or crackers basically in a tray that gets passed around the pews. And then they have little cups of grape juice that are in these trays also that get passed
Mhm.
around. And so everybody
Yeah.
takes one and puts it back in. And
Right.
so
Okay.
inevitably there's some left. And I totally remember kids doing that. And I'm like, look, now as an adult, I'm like, ugh,
Wait,
ugh,
ones that
Yeah.
other people had taken a drink out of?
yes.
Oh, no, never. I wouldn't have
You're
done
like,
that.
that wouldn't have been you.
No, if it was ones that no one had taken a drink out of. Yeah, no. I'm a
I
total
totally remember that
germaphobe,
happening.
always have been. I have a hard time receiving the blood out of a chalice everyone's been drinking out of other
Yeah,
stuff. Anyway.
I'm COVID kind of stopped that in a lot of places. So I haven't had the blood in a while. Um, but yeah, so yeah, they do have it was more of a reverent view um of communion, but it's still a symbol
Okay.
Very
than what I'd
reverent
experienced.
memorial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
was
yeah,
just
that's
curious.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
So yeah,
as you're exploring Catholicism, you're approaching, the Eucharist or the papacy, and you're sort of going into it hoping you don't find it convincing and then finding it convincing. Were there any maybe theological points or teachings or practices that you found challenging to accept as you were kind of finding a lot of this convincing? Were there any that you really struggled with?
so I think the reason I started with the papacy is the church authority thing was I knew was going to be my biggest issue. Um, and so that's why I started there.
Mm.
Um, and I but I mean Mary wasn't a huge stumbling block, but by the time I was digging into Mary, it was more of okay, I'm convinced of the papacy.
Mm.
I see it in this like you see it in early church father letters in First Clement. You see it in letters with Saint Ignatius of Antioch. In those seven letters, you see it early on in like that the Bishop of Rome had more authority than others, and I think one of the most convincing for me on that to help me get over that hurdle and seeing it in the first century was that the whole situation with First Clement. And so First Clement, I think is supposed to be the fourth pope, I want to say. Is that right? Anyone? I think it's the fourth pope. Um, and this letter was written, I think, 70 AD to 90 AD, somewhere in there. And it was written to the Corinthians. And so at the time, the Corinthians were in trouble again, which it's amazing that they had two New Testament letters from Paul just literally just
Ripping
wrecking
them up.
shop, right? Like you read First and Second Corinthians, and you're like, dang, he was mad. They were doing all kinds of mischief. Um, but they had basically kicked out their leadership.
Mhm.
So um basically a church split, right? And if that happened today, there'd be the first church of Corinth and the second church of Corinth, right? Like that's all it would be. Um but they wrote to Rome to ask what to do. And the weird thing for me when I'm looking at this in a historical context, the apostle John was closer to them. And I have a hard time believing that they couldn't have figured out where John was. Right. So you still have an apostle, like the one who Jesus loved, the one who was taking care of Mary after Jesus died, is still alive. Why wouldn't you write to him? Right. Like as a Protestant, that would be the dude I'm going to. Right. Like this dude was best friends with our Lord and Savior. Like I'm writing to that guy. But they didn't. They wrote to Rome to ask what to do. And then when Clement writes back, St. Clement writes back and tells him, dude, you can't do that. They listen to him. And to me, I'm like, that's that's pretty powerful. I mean, the fact that you're talking a Greek church is listening to a Roman church over a serious split within the church and congregation there. Like that was kind of a pivotal thought for me when I'm like, wow, that's kind of early proof that the Bishop of Rome had some authority there. Now, obviously, it wasn't called Pope then. I mean, that's way later, but you could see that structure already taking place there. And so um, that kind of helped me get over that hump because that was really a tough one. And also the Saint Ignatius talking about you need to follow your bishop. There's no church without the bishops. So yeah, that was probably the biggest one. And then Mary came later because I got the idea of I was fine with Mary being, the Theotokos, the mother of God, because there's definitely Protestant denominations that would disagree with that statement. Because that just made sense. Like it just makes logical sense. I feel like you're not being logical if she literally birthed God and you don't want to call her the mother of God. So, like, I just have, logically that one made sense. But the whole veneration of Mary and all of that didn't click until later. So that was like probably my other big hurdle that I had to go through. But I mean, I there was obviously other things like infant baptism, full immersion baptism versus sprinkling. Church of Christ is hardcore on the full immersion.
Mm.
And like it's not a baptism unless you're fully immersed, is the way I was raised. Um, and so yeah, I mean there was all these little issues, but I think those were probably the two big ones that I was struggling with the most at first.
I do want to get more into the Mary thing because I am a big Mary person, but that one was even hard for me when I started as a Catholic looking into it. I was like, this, I don't know, it didn't initially click for me, I would say for sure. But did you have issues with like sola scriptura, since you said you were raised in a very strong sola scriptura um, type? I guess with the papacy, if you are convinced that's true, that kind of knocks down sola scriptura, but was
Yeah,
that
and
hard for you?
it was also the church's definition of infallibility.
Mm,
Once I understood that, and I
yeah.
understood the guardrails that the Pope actually has
Uh-huh.
around him, that
Right, right.
I mean, to put it as simply as I can, if the Pope does anything that says that this is dogma and he's speaking from the chair of Peter, he has to be really clear that he's changing. He's not or it's more of a clarification. It's not changing anything because he can't go against anything that was taught before
Right.
that was dogmatic, and he can't go against anything that's biblical.
Hmm.
So it all has to align. And so, and the fact that I know a lot of people go, was it Vatican? No, it wasn't Vatican. It was Council of Trent is when they lay down the actual definition of infallibility, I believe it was.
That's Vatican
Um,
One.
Vatican One. See, I almost said that. I was like, wait, no, I'm getting my councils confused. There's too many.
Confusing.
Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
but it was more of a clarification because of the response to the Reformation. Be like, no, the Pope can't just run roughshod over everybody. This is his guardrails, and this is kind of and when you read about it and you read books on that, they're talking about like this is kind of what this was the guardrails they've always had, but now we have to clearly define it because it's being challenged.
Hmm.
And so the same type of deal in that same council when they define the books dogmatically, like it's the same list they defined in 403, but now it's being challenged. And so now we have to go, no, this is the clarification. Like it's being challenged. So now we have to like clearly define versus just, oh, everyone agrees with this.
Hmm.
And so that really helped because uh it's funny, like the longer I'm Catholic, the more I like Pope Francis. But I used to always say I was becoming Catholic in spite of Pope Francis because he says so many things that I was like, that is the dumbest, like, what is happening? And there's a lot of things he says, but if you understand infallibility, like he's just a man. He's never done anything from the chair of Peter. Like he's like,
Right.
there's only two popes that have done anything from that have actually dogmatically defined something and used that authority. So um, it's it it's funny now because now it's like I feel like what is it? What do they call people? Pope splainers.
Hmm.
Feel like I'm slowly getting into that camp. But yeah, that really helped me kind of get over this sola scriptura church authority thing and being able to be okay with it because that's I was really worried at that like because I my most Protestants definition of infallible pope is that everything that he says is infallible and he can never do anything wrong and he's just this holy man, and so if he does something crazy, oh well, I guess we got to start doing that now, and that's not the case at all. So that really helped me understand everything.
Yeah, I think that helped me be more comfortable with the papacy too, as I was actually looking into, I mean, I was raised Catholic, and then when I was like, oh, do I want to stay Catholic? Does this actually make the most sense? And I was shocked at how many popes, like John Paul II never made an ex cathedra statement or
Yeah.
defined any dogma. And I was so shocked by that. And to know that most dogmas came out of needing to defend or define. and fight a
Yep.
heresy or kind of thing. So
Even the
yeah.
Theotokos, it was the same
Yeah.
thing. They were debating the nature of
Of
Christ.
Christ. Yeah.
And so that's where that dogmatic statement came from. It was trying
Hmm.
to further define the nature of Christ.
Hmm. Yeah. So I heard you bring up that there can be a lot of misconceptions about what infallibility is. I think even in Catholicism, there can be that
Yes.
misconception. And then I think a lot of Protestants have a misconception as well. Um, Usually, sometimes they might even get from other Catholics what that infallibility means. But were there any other misconceptions that you encountered as you were converting, or that you even see now as a Catholic about the Catholic faith?
Oh, a ton. I just did a video on once saved, always saved, right?
Mhm.
And even the comment section in that, I'm seeing these comments in there of people that obviously is an absolute misconception. And because I think the once saved, always saved goes into works and
Mhm.
faith argument really easily, right? Like, because if you're once saved, always saved, your works don't necessarily matter. Like, that's what I know most Protestants wouldn't say that, right? But that's what it can boil down to. And that's kind of what we see happening in these very liberal Bible churches
Mhm.
um happening today. And so this whole works in faith thing is a big one. I think Mary's a big one. I think the fact we have statues, like there's so many misconceptions. And I believed all of them before I started
Mhm.
looking into this. And so yeah, I think there's we could go on and on and on about the misconceptions that are out there. And I think it was Fulton Sheen that said, "What is it? There's not 100 people in America that disagree with the Catholic Church, but there's millions that don't understand it, or something like that." Like it was basically like if they understood what we're talking about, they would be in agreement with us. But there's all these misconceptions, and people don't understand. They don't get what we're talking about, and so they think they disagree with us.
Mhm.
So you've talked a lot about, your journey, like looking into a lot of things. And what I'm hearing is it's very intellectual. Like you're looking into the history, you're looking into the theology, you're doing a ton of research. But on the other side of it, what role did like prayer or spiritual direction or guidance, what role did that play in your conversion process?
I think the spiritual part started kicking in as soon as I made the decision. I think we need to be Catholic.
Mm,
Um, because it was strictly not that I wasn't praying about it, but it was really for about 7, 8 months a very intellectual pursuit.
Sure.
Um, and and yeah, I mean, I was obviously still praying about it because I was really worried about having to become Catholic. But I think the when it started becoming more of the spiritual, uh, when the spirit started kicking in for me was so the day I finally was okay with the papacy, I come out of my office and I tell my wife, like, I think we need to be Catholic. And I think she could have fallen over at this point because she thought those were words I would never say. Um, and so we decided, okay, well, let's find a church. Oh, look, they have mass on Saturdays. Let's go to a mass on Saturday. Um, and I'd been to Catholic masses for funerals and weddings, right? So that's not a tip. Like I never thought of them as mass, right? Like that's how Catholics do their wedding ceremonies. That's how they do their funerals. Like I didn't think of it as mass. So I wasn't looking at it that way when I've gone to those. But I was extremely worried. I had a really uncomfortable experience at an Anglican church
mm,
during that time where I was really mad at God and having, doubts in so this was back in 2012. It had to have been 2012 for Ash Wednesday. my wife was like, we're going to church for Ash Wednesday. I'm like, okay, like fine, whatever. Like I'll go. And there was a Anglican church that's like really high Anglican church. So they had, I mean, is looking back now, I'm like, wow, that's like very Catholic-esque that this church had. And when I went to this service, I can't explain it other than I feel like the devil was just straight attacking me during this entire service. But for no reason whatsoever, I had this massive desire to run out of there and anger boiling up in me throughout the entire service. Like it was, and even while it was happening, I was like, what is going on? Like, there's no reason for me to be this mad. Like, what is going on? And look, I didn't run out, I didn't make a scene, I didn't do anything, but it was this terrifying experience because even at the time, I'm like, this has to be Satan trying to hold on to me. Like, I don't know what this is, but this is evil. Like, whatever I am experiencing right now. And it was like permeating through my body. Like, I was pulsing with anger during this service. And so now I'm trying to go to a Catholic church. And in my head, I'm going, please, Lord, do not let that happen again. Like, I don't want to feel that again. I don't know where else I'm going to go if I have that feeling when I go to mass. Like I'm terrified that that's going to be my experience again.
Mm.
And by the grace of God, we went to a Saturday mass thinking that it wasn't going to be well attended. It was, but it was a really big parish we ended up going to. Um, and we sat in the back, and I had never felt more peace in my entire life during a church service. I had no idea what was going on. I was a second late doing the signs of the cross. I had no idea what anyone was saying with their responses. I'm a fish out of water, but I felt this overwhelming peace
Mm.
from the moment I walked in, and especially once the procession started. And like I knew that was God answering my prayers and telling me, yeah, you're in the right spot. And so I think that's kind of when the spiritual started happening. Because I'm always intellectual first and then the heart comes. So that's just the way I function. But yeah, I don't even remember what the homily was about. I don't remember anything. I just know this overwhelming sense of peace that I had never felt in any service I'd ever been to.
Mhm. So from then on, did you decide I'm going to start the RCIA process? I'm going to start converting. And how did those around you, especially your family, respond to that? Or how did that look like telling them that you were going to take this step to convert?
So I was a chicken and didn't say a word to my family until about 6 months in. Um, when I started talking to, I had a few friends that um were very anti-authority anything, and they were kind of like, "What the heck are you doing, dude? Like that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." And we're not happy about it. And it's to me, they didn't even go to church, so it didn't bother me, right? But I knew my family was not going to respond positively on it. And so we started going to RCIA. My wife started her annulment process, which we can kind of get into that a little bit. Um, and it was probably January. So we started in September, I think, with RCIA. And it wasn't until January that I told my mom. Um, and they had come at me so hard about joining the Methodist church and were asking me things that I just didn't understand because, like I said, it was a band-aid for me. So I wasn't looking into any of like really deeply into their theology. I was just making sure I agreed with the high points. Um, and so I didn't want them to ask me something and go, I don't know. And so I literally wrote, I feel like I actually need to write this out more, but I wrote about 40 pages worth of walking through all of my arguments, all of like the main things that I had a feeling that they would be that I had issues with that I knew they would have issues with. And so once I felt comfortable with that, and I had about 40 pages worth typed out from you name it, like or whatever topic, from baptism, infant baptism, to the real presence, to the papacy, to Mary and this praying to the saints, like all of that stuff. Then I felt like I was okay to bring it up, and it did not go great. So so yeah, I think I was shopping at Target, and I was like, I'm gonna tell her. It's like, yeah, mom. So we're going through RCIA, and I think we're gonna join the Catholic Church. And her first response is a jab at pedophile popes or
Okay.
pedophile priests.
Mm.
She's like, well, you can't leave your boys alone with the priests, was her literal first sentence.
Mm.
And I was just like, great. Okay. Yep, that's kind of what I thought. So, yeah, and it hasn't gotten that much better. So, and it's been years. But yeah, it was difficult, for sure. But I knew it was coming, which was kind of I was able to prepare myself for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it and I think with converts, the really difficult thing is you do stand the possibility of losing friends, of your family alienating you. Not that they've broken off the relationship with me at all. I still talk with my parents and my family members. We do.
Mm.
But it's not the same. And where I kind of concluded was, I'm not here to make you happy. My
Mm.
job as a husband and father is to put my family on the best path that they can, that I can see forward to get them to heaven. And
Mhm.
so my salvation, my wife's salvation, and my kids' salvation is way more important to me than anyone else's opinion about what I'm doing.
Mm.
And I'll go ahead and take the heat. I'll go ahead and take whatever you're going to dish out at me, because me as the spiritual leader of my household,
Mm.
that's my job. Like that's my main job, as for my vocation, is to lead my family to Christ. And so whether it's my mom or my grandma telling me that I've given up on the Lord, like I'll
Mm.
take the heat, because I know I'm going on the right path.
Mm.
Yeah, it's hard. You have to follow whichever way it leads, you have to follow your conscience and what you truly believe is true. I think that's what Jesus calls us to.
Hmm.
And that's hard though when it has real life consequences and can disrupt, yeah, relationships with family or friends. But I'm interested in are there any, so being Catholic, are there any there you can have different types of devotions or spiritual practices. And now as a Catholic, are there any type of devotions or spiritual practices that you've really been attracted to or you found have very much enriched your spiritual life now being Catholic and have helped strengthen you throughout this time of
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely the rosary. Um, and I think it's like everyone, right? Like there's some times where I'm praying it every day for 6 months, and then something happens where I get busy and it drops off for a few months and I'm back at it. But doing a daily rosary in the morning, starting my day thinking about the life of Christ, um,
Mm.
has been, and every time that I get back into it, I'm like, why did I stop doing this? Um, it's been amazing. And lately I've been trying to do more mental prayer type stuff, especially when I'm focusing on the mysteries and asking, like, Lord, what do you want me to see in this scene? And just having, like, I don't know, like I had with on the crucifixion, right? On that mystery. I remember this was a few weeks ago or a month ago or two, and I'm really trying to just, while I'm praying that decade, just act like I'm there on the foot of the cross. Like, what am I seeing? What am I looking at? And and at the time, I don't know, like we all deal with guilt, right? And I'm like, man, I put you up there, right? I'm thinking that. And but then I have this vivid image that popped in my head of Mary actually turning and looking at me while she's kneeling down there looking up at her son. And I was just, I don't know, like I'd never like thought of that. Like it wasn't like I was trying to have that image pop in my head. And it was like profound sadness in her eyes. And it like if I wasn't sitting down doing this, I probably would have fallen on my knees at that point. And so I think the rosary, focusing on mental prayer, um, all those type of things, I think it's just it's made my life better, 100%.
Hmm. Have you heard of Immaculée Ibagazi,
Hmm.
who I don't want to get into it too much, but she was a Rwandan, she was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, and what part of what helped her survive was praying the rosary, and she had these like very vivid, almost miraculous like images of walking through the mysteries of the rosary, especially the sorrowful mysteries and like being with
Yeah, those are
Mary throughout
brutal
all of
to
those.
focus on.
And so I think I'll send you the link to that book. I think you would
Please
really
do.
enjoy that.
Please do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, some days when when the sorrowful mysteries are coming up, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, do I have energy to do this today? Like,
Yeah.
Mm.
It's good for Lent.
it's great for Lent.
Pray through those. Yeah.
Yeah. So you
Well, thank
wanted
you so
to
much for
go
sharing
ahead.
your story. I'm just thinking back on like your challenges with like digging through all these different doctrines and then even just interacting with your family and the tension with those relationships. Let's say you had someone before you who was considering converting, who was really in that like spiritual battle and wrestling. What sort of advice or yeah, what would you tell them going into it? Because I think you're talking about how like, oh, as a convert, you have to be prepared for, relationships to change. I think that's really a good advice to give someone. What else would you tell them if they were kind of starting on that journey?
I would say focus on Christ
Mm.
and keep your eye on him. Because I think if it's going to be a difficult road ahead, and praise God if it's not for you. Like it wasn't an easy one for me. And I think a lot of conversion stories you hear, it's not.
Mm.
Um, but focus on the beauty of the Catholic faith. Like there's so many amazing things in devotions, like you were just talking about, like the Divine Mercy Chaplet. I love that one. I forgot about that one for a second there. And so many other things that you can focus on that help you center on Christ. That, if I, I always, I think if you can keep your focus more on Christ and not around the noise,
Mm.
it does make the path easier because there's noise on both sides. Like it's not like I heard someone say sometime, join the Catholic Church, the water's terrible. Like there's stuff going on in our church that is just ridiculous right now. It's
Yeah.
not that I mean, we started off great with the first pope denying Christ and one of the bishops betraying him, right? Like we kicked it off with a banger. So it's not like it, it's don't listen to the noise, folk. Keep your eyes on Christ, and amazing things will happen, and things will start clicking, and definitely get plugged into your parish. I think that is a key thing that I think Protestants do a way better job at than Catholics do, with small groups and like doing all these different things where I think a lot of parishes it's just mass, and they might have like a men or women's Bible study and a few other little things, but figure out how you can get involved with your parish, to start building those connections, because um, it's definitely people go to mass to go to mass, and then a lot of parishes like there's some talking once you get out, but it's not like when you go to a Protestant church where It's just different, right? So definitely try and I would say those two things for someone looking to convert.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think a lot of Catholics can, or a lot of people converting to Catholicism might have a view of the Catholic Church that it might not have some of the same issues they had in their church before, or doesn't have issues, and that's definitely not true. So,
Right.
yeah, I think that's good advice, and just good advice for being a Christian in general. Um,
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
lot within the Christian church as a whole that can a lot of noise, and it can be hard. So it's good, I think, to just focus on Christ. That's just good advice.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. Do you want to cover Mary real quick on how I think, because I saw that, don't one of y'all have, didn't I see? Oh, yeah, it's behind you, the candle of Our Lady of
Oh yeah.
Guadalupe.
Yes.
Um,
Love to hear that. Yeah.
okay, so this was during an RCIA class. Because like I said, I was fine with, yeah, I was even okay with with Mary being Queen of Heaven, because if you look at the typology of the um King of David versus the kingdom of God, the queen was the mother of the king. So that I was like, fine, that makes sense. In Romans 12, like I get it. Like, okay, I'm good there. But it was like, what's Mary's role? Like, what is all these apparitions? Like, as a Protestant, I don't know any of this stuff, right? And so the week that we talked about Mary, they talked about Our Lady of Guadalupe and Fatima. And
Hmm.
I had never heard any of these stories before. So this was like brand new news to me at this point. And what blew my mind and what I realized is every single time Mary shows up, it's always pointing people to her son.
Hmm.
Every time. Like you look at Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I love the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Like it's just so amazing. You're talking 1530, Protestant Reformation is in full view. You know, millions of people have left the Catholic Church, and the Spaniards are not being able to convert the Aztecs and the locals here in Mexico.
Hmm.
And they're having just a horrible time. And you have this apparition, and you have oh, what is his name? It's skipping my head right now.
Juan Diego?
Juan Diego, thank you. Juan Diego um bringing those roses to the bishop and opening his tunic, and then there's the image of Mary. And the fact that within 10 years there's 9 million new Catholics because of that. Like that's an incredible statement. There was more converts than it to Catholicism than we lost in the Reformation because of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Like more people came to Christ in that time period. Like I mean that's an insane turn of events, right? I mean, you got to think about the Catholic Church at that point, and Christendom and as a whole is just an absolute turmoil, right? I mean, you have wars starting off over Protestants and Catholicism. You have persecution on both sides. Everyone's at their throats, and Mary shows up to this peasant and absolutely changes the Western Hemisphere in one instant. And the fact that we still have like it's still there and it shouldn't be, and the scientific research done on that where they can't even explain how the images are even on there. There's so much into that that's just amazing. And then not even going into Fatima with the mystery of the sun, or the miracle of the sun. Like
Mm.
that whole story is another one that just blew my mind. And it really clicked then. I'm like, oh, that's what God's using Mary for. She is our mother, and she's trying to like knock us back in line. Like, come on, come back to my son. Come on. Y'all can do it. Um, and and that's what God's using her for in our lives, is to continually go, come on, kids, like act right. Let's go. Come on, come back. And that's kind of what helped me go, oh, I get it now. Like I had to understand her role.
Mhm.
I think for me to be okay with uh with praying to Mary, and like, yeah. So I think the learning about that and figuring that out really helped it cement to me.
Yeah. We plan to do some more episodes on the Marian apparitions on our channel, so that'll be fun
Yeah,
to
you
do
went to
more research
Lourdes, didn't
into.
you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
beautiful. I recommend going. It's
Ah,
just like stunning, even if you could show up there and not even be a Christian or Catholic, and it's just beautiful. So
yeah, I'm sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But Mary's amazing. And I'm just blessed that that clicked, because I think it's just added so much to my devotion to Christ.
Yeah, I'm just a very similar experience. So thank you so much for sharing that. And just thank you so much for sharing your entire conversion story. It seems like it hasn't been an easy process. But thank you for taking the time to, yeah, come and share with us and our listeners.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it. And I love y'all's channel and your podcast.
Thank you.
Keep it up. Like, it's so cool that y'all are just talking about hard topics and really just still being really good friends, and talking about things where people like to argue about, but you guys are having conversations, which is fantastic. I love it. So keep it up.
And everyone should go check out Quest for Faith with Bryan if you want to learn more about Bryan's story. Listen to some of the guests he's had on. We really highly recommend it. I know I listened to your video, just sharing your story about converting and your wife's side of the story as well. So, yeah, we definitely recommend going and checking those out.
Thank you. I appreciate it.